That's right, Alan Thicke, dead at 69 years old, and dies in the most Canadian fashion possible of a heart attack while playing hockey with his 19-year-old son. Alan Thicke, 69, he looks sensational, great Canadian. Greg, you remember Alan Thicke?
Oh, yes, I remember Alan Thicke quite clearly. He was a famous game show host. I've watched him when I was a kid growing up. He was on, I saw him periodically show up on Canadian dramas and so forth. But I haven't seen much of him lately, of course, but I do remember him. And I see his son Robin did that thing with, her Miley Cyrus. But yeah, that's too bad. 69, that's pretty young.
Yeah, and he had a lot of money, so doesn't necessarily buy you time.
No, it doesn't. 69 is not that far off for me either, so a little mortality creeping in there.
Speaking of mortality, the United States, is it on its last legs?
That's a very good question. I mean, I'm in my book, The Host and the Parasite, How Israel's Fifth Column Consumed America, I argue that America has been in decline since at least 1980, where it was quite obvious that a unelected clique of power brokers took over the government and progressively turned the United States into what we now see as a fascist surveillance state. The furor over Trump, this sort of tempest in a teapot, is, I think, the death throes, possibly, of the oligarchy, oligarchy's control on government. I mean, they were unhappy that Hillary Clinton didn't win because she had been groomed for the job since 2008. But because Trump is not the old boys club, he is deemed a threat to those who have been in power since Ronald Reagan. And tyranny not going gently into that good night. This is sour grapes of the most, the stench of the sour grapes would fill a winery. This is horrible. This is the most unprofessional, whiny, loser mentality that has ever been inflicted on the American public and the world. I mean, in 2000, should have petitioned for full state recount of Florida, but he did not, figuring he might not win, and he didn't want to upset the electoral system. He did a terrible thing, if you want to call it that, and conceded defeat to George W. Bush. If there had been a case for fighting the election, that would have been it, because there was a reason to believe that there was a possibility that Florida was illegally counted. However, in this case, we have a situation where the Clinton forces, who represent the oligarchy, are manufacturing propaganda to discredit their own electoral system. And by doing so, they are subverting American democracy. Now, you can say that America is not much of a democracy, and you would be right. It hasn't been a democracy for many, many years, decades even. But the fact that people went into this election knowing what the rules were, and they played by the rules to some degree. And because they did that, we're now saying, well, the rules were wrong. We shouldn't have had the Electoral College vote in favor of Trump, but the popular vote go for Clinton. Let's get rid of the Electoral College. Let's go challenge those electors. Let's bully them into changing their minds. So right now, we have a situation where the public voted on November the 8th, but the Clintonites are not respecting the vote, and they are trying to overturn what was really a legitimate election. Now, you can argue that Trump cheated in certain states. I could charge that Clinton cheated in some states. There's cheating in every election, I would imagine. Certainly, George W. Bush cheated in 2008, 2000, and in 2004, yet there was never this hysterical hue and cry demanding that states be overturned, that recounts be made. This is a situation which is far and away less severe than what George W. Bush did. And because of that, we have to ask ourselves, why is now Trump the target of such a frenetic campaign to reverse an electoral decision? And it cannot be due to the Electoral College. It cannot be due to his non-winning of the popular vote. It cannot be to the fact that he is woefully unqualified. George W. Bush is woefully unqualified. Ronald Reagan was woefully unqualified. But there was never this competency question. What we have to look at is who Trump is, what he doesn't represent. And this is the last, this could be the last fight of the oligarchy to hold on to power. And if it manages to prevent Donald Trump from being sworn into office, we could have, I would think, a wholesale constitutional crisis that, if it happened, I would hope would split the United States and force it to start over. Because as it is now, the United States is enthralled to foreign corporations and foreign governments. It is not even remotely representative of its public. Canada is pretty much the same way. So maybe it's time that Donald Trump did get for a person like Donald Trump to come along. And his very presence has been the great magnifying glass that Americans have needed for so long. This is what we have done. We have elected Donald Trump as president. Is our entire political system so utterly cocked up? Well, yes, it is. What are we going to do about it? Well, we're going to try to overthrow him. Well, maybe Americans now are waking up to the fact that they don't have any say in their government, that hidden deep government oligarchs run the show, and it's time to do something about it. If, in fact, this brings it all to a head, in the last 35, 36 years of neo-fascist subordination comes to a head, maybe this is the best thing. We can't thank Donald Trump enough for winning the election.
Unbelievably, former cabinet ministers are now coming forth claiming that Brexit was a result of Russian hacking.
Well, I bet they're going to say the Kennedy assassination was a result of Russian hacking, too. This is one of those horrible fake memes that gets promulgated because people don't stop to question it. It's a convenient excuse. It becomes the bogeyman. There is no proof of anything. Not one person has come forward to show that the Russians did anything illegal. There is no proof of anything.
But you said it on a recent show, Greg. If you believe it enough, it becomes fact.
That is true. And this is why fake news or propaganda has to compete on a par with real news. But if the energy behind promulgating a false narrative is so strong that it overwhelms the truth, then we live in a false, unreal world, and anything a government or organization says can be taken at face value. Why don't we just make up something now? Why don't we make up that Iran was behind September the 11th? Or maybe the Russians are responsible for the banking meltdown in 2007. The Russians have become the ubiquitous bogeyman, the devil figure that America always needs to justify its role as the great champion of truth, justice, and so forth. Brexit was just because the British were tired of being pushed around by the bloody European central banks. Brexit was a good decision. It was an intelligent decision. It was a political decision. And the one thing the oligarchs don't like is politics. Because politics and economics sometimes don't go together. And if a government, as a political representative, decides to tax corporations to serve the interests of the public, the corporations get their backs up and they try to kick that person out of office. Now, I'm not saying Donald Trump is going to do that. He's surrounding himself with a bunch of alligators from the swamp he's supposed to be draining. But at least he doesn't seem to buy into the need to ratchet up the debt to start wars of aggression for Israel. And you will find, I believe, that is the major reason why he is being attacked mercilessly. Because it's that interest group that controls the Democratic Party. And so we have now a situation where a foreign government, is exercising more influence on the election of the United States than the people who voted for the president. Now, what's really interesting is that the Electoral College was established initially to prevent foreign governments from influencing votes. Now, whether that could have happened or not, I really don't know. But that's what Alexander Hamilton believed. He was one of the biggest proponents of it. Hamilton represented the aristocratic strain of American democracy. He didn't trust the masses. He felt that they should be governed for their own good. And against him was Thomas Jefferson. They hated each other. So if we look at this as a way that the Electoral College should be used to prevent foreign influence from polluting American elections, well, why hasn't it been invoked before now? Because so much Israeli money has been used to buy campaigns for senators and congressmen, governors and presidents, that the country really is bought and paid for. It has sold out to the money that makes it serve a foreign government. So if the Electoral College were designed to stop this, why hasn't it been called into question long before now? The fact is the Electoral College did its job. It balanced out the rural votes versus the urban votes. Because if it weren't for the Electoral College, the heavily populated urban centers on the coasts and Chicago would dominate every election. Those states have the most electoral votes. So if the highest population centers. So if the population in those cities all generally think alike, then there's never a chance that the establishment party would lose. It would be very difficult to imagine something like a rural awakening, where the center states, the Midwest, the South, the Southwest decided we're going to fight en masse against the Ivy League states or California. That's hard to imagine. So the Electoral College, rather than being a monument to anti-democratic interference, might in fact be a very good thing. Because for the most part, the popular vote and the Electoral College vote coincide. It's only rare that they don't. It almost happened with Kennedy and Nixon, but that was also a very close election. So, I don't really buy into this fake meme about Russian hacking. We have to see it for what it is, a deliberate attempt at subversion of the American popular will. Even though the popular will voted for Clinton over Trump, it is the Electoral College that is the rules by which everybody played. It is the rules by which everybody spent their money and campaigned for votes. You lost, too bad. You don't like the way the rules are, don't run. In Canada, we have something called recall legislation in some provinces, where the people in the constituency, if they don't like their representative, they can vote to have that person called back and have another election. Well, that's also undemocratic. Once we have a vote, whether you like it or not, if it's done legally, then you got to accept the decision. If there's a constitutional reason why it should be overturned, well, then fight it on the Constitution. Don't pander to the masses. Don't use an unpopular person as an excuse to stampede the masses into serving someone's political interest. That's not what democracy is. That's what Aristotle was so keen to distinguish between. He distinguished constitutional government from democracy, because he found democracy to be just the collective will of the masses, the mob, the unenlightened, the uneducated, which can be, go one way or go the other. It could be influenced by emotion or prejudice. But a society based on a constitution, not on popular opinion, was a far more stable, just society. And that's what the United States likes to think of itself as. But when we see people like John Podesta and James Clapper trying to foment this anti-Russian propaganda, we see that they're pandering to the masses. They're trying to brainwash the masses, subvert the masses in decision of November the 8th.
Regardless if the election gets overturned, and I fear for every man, woman, and child in the United States if that should happen. But regardless, the presidency of Donald Trump has already been sullied.
Yes, it has. As a matter of fact, even if he were to survive the Electoral College decision, on January 3rd, Congress has to ratify the Electoral College vote. And if Congress wants to be pissy, it can say, we will not ratify it. And then I don't know what happens. Does Barack Obama stay in office longer than his term in violation of the 22nd Amendment? Does a compromise candidate get put forth that was never voted on in the first place? I really don't know. But, as I said before, Donald Trump is the best thing that's happened to the United States in a very long time. And if he doesn't become president, then I think the United States should just dissolve itself and start over again. I just don't see the United States. The United States should be dead anyway. Every society has to have a dark age at some point. Everything has to come to an end. We would not have had the Renaissance if it hadn't been for 1,000 years of Christian superstition, stifling the intellectual history of Greece and Rome. Now, they survived somewhat during this period, but the Dark Age was all about the church and anti-intellectualism and mysticism. Well, that caused a reaction. Well, we need to get beyond this. We need something more substantial, more concrete, more hard-edged. Well, people rediscovered the Renaissance, the ancient classical learnings, thanks to the Arabs who retained the learning of ancient Greece. Without the Arabs, without the Muslim cultures, we wouldn't have had the Renaissance. Tell that to the Christian bigots and the Jewish bigots who want to persecute Muslims just because they're Muslims. The great Greek classical tradition came about after a very long Dark Age in Mycenae. You see, Dark Ages, when periods where cultures end, they have to end at some point so that new life may grow. A forest fire kills trees, but it allows new growth to come. The United States has been a decadent, almost zombie nation for so long that it's hard to remember a time when the United States stood for anything other than corporate greed and wars for Israel. So maybe it's the best thing for everybody if the United States just collapsed, because we need to have something in this continent that represents the popular will, that represents democracy, that represents the Constitution. And the United States has been, anything but that for so long.
See, my concern is that Donald Trump has revealed that the United States is in fact under a full dictatorship tyranny, and that the government was usurped long ago, but held up appearances of continuity. And they will initiate some sort of what we in Canada would call the War Measures Act, but some kind of a martial law suspending the Constitution.
That is entirely possible. And if that were to happen, that would further give truth to the fact that America is not a democracy. President Jimmy Carter said America is not a democracy, it's an oligarchy.
Yeah, maybe the word dictatorship was incorrect.
Well, dictatorship is not entirely wrong. I think it's a little bit inexact, but I would say it's an autocracy. I mean, for example, when Obama became president, he had to pick his cabinet. He didn't pick it. It was handed to him by corporate contractors. Here, these are the people you should nominate. The President of the United States has never been more than a figurehead for so long. I mean, it's an embarrassment. I would hate to be the President of the United States. John Kerry, the Secretary of State, is the most ineffectual mannequin that has ever held that office. He's an embarrassment to himself. He goes out and he does the bidding of people that he can't stand. He's not an American. He's an American sock puppet. It's a disgrace what Americans think they have and what they really have. Let it all come crashing down. That may sound like a harsh thing to recommend, but how long can the United States go on pretending it's a democracy? How long can it expect its public to vote in elections that have been rigged from the beginning? The weird thing about Trump is that even though he's bombastic and not terribly qualified, he does have the virtue of being right on two counts. One, the election was rigged. And two, the Russian propaganda story is utterly fake. But because the oligarchy, the media, and all the mouthpieces that propagate this have established truth as being what the government says it is, the truth that Donald Trump is expressing gets caricatured as a lie. Even here in Canada, the Globe and Mail wrote this asinine editorial a couple days ago that looks like it had been written by the CIA. It accepted without question the claim that Russia had hacked the Democratic National Committee. It said that Trump is making a grave mistake by dismissing this. The minute you assert something like that and you start propagating it, it becomes almost impossible to fight. So now we have this great lie that's going to be used to justify war against Russia, it could be used to justify war against Russia, overturning an election, and utterly, I think, bringing to an end the United States. At least I hope so.
Have these agencies been so politicized in the past, the FBI, CIA?
I don't think so. Well, I can say for one thing, actually, that William Casey, who was Ronald Reagan's CIA director in 1981, made the amazing observation that we'll know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false. That is a direct quote from William Casey. So what we have now is the culmination of 36 years of disinformation from the Central Intelligence Agency. It goes back long before that, I'm quite sure, especially with the Bay of Pigs and so forth. But the fact that the United States CIA director admits that they have a disinformation campaign and they want the American to believe a false narrative, that is the greatest expression of what has happened to the United States. The false narrative is all the American public is supposed to believe. Anyone who speaks the truth, like Edward Snowden or Julian Assange or Chelsea Manning, Sibel Edmonds, these people are treated as a threat. They're a threat because they tell the truth. They tell the truth because the people in government are criminals. Criminals don't like being criticized. They don't like having to account for themselves. We live in an Orwellian world. I mean, George Orwell was a prophet.
There's nothing more dangerous than truth in a time of deceit.
That is true. And we live in a time of deceit. And as I said, the good thing is now that deceit is undeniable. The one thing the oligarchy has lost is containment. Because the internet, even though it's still the internet is still reasonably free. There is censorship on it. You know it and I know it. But there are enough people out there who know they're being lied to. The oligarchy has nowhere to go but down. The only problem is how long it can hold on with it by its fingertips before it falls down the black hole that it's carving out for itself.